The standard room in St. James's Palace had never felt so narrow, nor had the silence inside it ever carried such a physical weight. High ceilings framed in gilded plaster reflected the sharp white lights of modern television cameras, illuminating 200 Privy Counsellors gathered in tight formation. They stood shoulder to shoulder, former prime ministers, senior bishops, justices of the Supreme Court, and seasoned parliamentarians, all dressed in dark, formal attire, their faces carved into masks of solemn anticipation. At the front of the Grand Hall, standing before the crimson velvet dais, Prince William remained motionless. His posture was rigid, his jaw set in a line of quiet resolve that belied the monumental shift occurring around him. Beside him stood Queen Camilla, her hands clasped tightly over her handbag, her shoulders slightly hunched against the oppressive atmosphere of the room. Her breathing was visible, shallow and quick, contrasting sharply with the measured, stoic demeanor of the man beside her. The ceremony of the Accession Council had progressed with a clinical, almost eerie efficiency. For centuries, the machinery of the British constitutional monarchy had operated on the principle that the crown never dies, moving instantly from one head to another without a moment's pause. Yet the reality of executing that ancient procedure in real time carried a raw, unscripted intensity that no script or rehearsal could fully prepare room for. The Lord President of the Council stepped forward, unrolling a heavy parchment scroll lined with traditional calligraphy. As the official declaration was read aloud, proclaiming William as the rightful sovereign and assigning to him the titles, honors, and heavy duties of the king, a subtle shift rippled through the assembled audience. The formal reading was not merely a ceremonial announcement, it was the precise legal instrument transferring the ultimate symbolic authority of the state. Every eye in the hall was fixed on the parchment, and then on the prince who was, in that exact second, becoming monarch. As the final words of the declaration echoed off the historic walls, the atmosphere inside the council chamber buckled under the immense weight of the moment. Queen Camilla's gaze flickered rapidly across the crowd, taking in the bowed heads and the pale faces of senior statesmen who were witnessing the sudden, total reconfiguration of the royal household. Her knuckles turned white against the strap of her bag as the full political and personal reality of the declaration settled into the air. The legal text left no ambiguity regarding the immediate assumption of power, formalizing a dramatic transition that stripped away the lingering buffers of the previous reign. For months, whispers had circulated through the corridors of Whitehall regarding the speed with which the transition mechanisms would be executed, but seeing the royal assent finalized on the parchment made the absolute nature of the power shift undeniable. A heavy hush fell over the hall as the clerk positioned the oath document on the signing table, inviting the new monarch to affix his signature. William stepped forward with deliberate, steady strides, his expression unreadable as he picked up the pen. The scratch of the nib against the parchment was the only sound audible over the synchronized hum of the broadcast equipment positioned along the perimeter. As he signed his name, cementing the accession legalities, the balance of authority in the room consolidated entirely around him. The surrounding officials bowed in unison, a synchronized motion that marked the definitive end of the old regime and the formal commencement of the new. The sheer finality of the act hit the room like a physical shockwave, cutting through the carefully curated decorum of the ancient institution. It was in that precise fragment of time, as the final bow was offered and the room held its collective breath, that Camilla's composure fractured completely. Her body swayed noticeably to the left, her balance giving way as her knees buckled beneath the weight of her heavy silk skirt. A sharp, audible gasp erupted from the front row of councillors as her hands slipped uselessly off the edge of the signing table, failing to catch her fall. Before the security detail standing at the perimeter could react, her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor at the foot of the dais. The sudden, violent thud of her fall shattered the rigid decorum of the chamber, sending an immediate surge of panic through the gathered dignitaries. William reacted instinctively, turning sharply on his heel the moment the rustle of fabrics and the gasp of the crowd broke the silence. He dropped down immediately beside her, his hands extending to support her head and shoulders off the cold floor, his face dropping its rigid composure for a brief second of visible concern. Medical officers, stationed discreetly behind the velvet curtains, burst through the entrances, moving rapidly past stunned cabinet members who instinctively backed away to clear a path. The polished, seamless illusion of royal continuity collapsed into a chaotic flurry of urgent murmurs, rustling wool suits, and the frantic orders of royal protection officers attempting to secure the immediate area. Cameras flashed erratically from the media gallery as technicians scrambled to redirect live broadcast feeds, but the raw image of the collapse had already been captured, sending shockwaves far beyond the historic walls of the palace. The emergency team worked with swift, practiced precision, positioning a fold-out screen to block the scene from the eyes of the stunned Privy Council, though the tension in the room only mounted behind the temporary barrier. Senior politicians stood frozen in place, whispering frantically among themselves as they processed the unprecedented sequence of events unfolding before them. The Accession Council, a ceremony defined for generations by its absolute adherence to script and order, had suddenly become the backdrop for an unscripted crisis at the highest level of the state. The contrast between the formal handover of ultimate constitutional authority and the immediate human frailty demonstrated on the floor created an agonizing friction that left everyone present motionless. Outside the palace gates, the crowd that had gathered under the grey London sky remained oblivious for a few brief minutes, waving flags and staring up at the balcony where the official proclamation was scheduled to be read. But inside the high walls of St. James's, time seemed to stand completely still. As the medical team monitored Camilla's vital signs and prepared to transport her to the private apartments, William stood up slowly, adjusting his coat. The weight of his new role descended upon him, not in a moment of quiet reflection, but amid the sirens, the rushed steps of paramedics, and the stunned gazes of 200 state officials waiting to see how the new sovereign would navigate his very first minute on the throne. The partition was drawn fully around the unconscious figure on the floor, its dark fabric creating a stark, temporary wall within the gold-leaf framing of the hall. The medical personnel worked in muted, urgent communication, their words swallowed by the vast acoustics of the ceiling, while the rest of the room remained locked in an agonizing stillness. Standing just outside the makeshift curtain, William adjusted his cuffs with hands that showed no tremor, though his eyes remained fixed on the narrow gap in the fabric. The transition from heir to sovereign had occurred not through a gradual procession of ceremonial steps, but in a fractured instant where the highest duties of state collided directly with personal vulnerability. The Privy Counsellors, arranged in rigid rows behind him, observed every shift in his posture, acutely aware that the stability of the entire institutional apparatus was currently being measured by his immediate response. The silence in the room was dense, broken only by the low, rhythmic hum of the broadcast equipment that continued to transmit live data streams to the network control rooms down the hall. Although the primary visual feeds had been diverted to wide, exterior shots of the palace courtyard the moment the collapse occurred, the sudden break in the carefully planned broadcast schedule had already triggered alarms across global newsrooms. Behind the velvet drapes, senior communications officials were engaged in hushed, furious consultations on their encrypted devices, attempting to manage the narrative before speculation could fill the vacuum created by the sudden pause in proceedings. The raw reality of the event had bypassed the carefully constructed filters of Buckingham Palace's press office, leaving the public apparatus scrambling to handle a double narrative: the legal birth of a new reign and the sudden physical collapse of the outgoing Queen Consort. Within the enclosure, the lead medical officer signaled for an emergency transport chair, determining that Camilla needed immediate evaluation away from the pressure and heat of the television lighting. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, clouded with confusion as she took in the unfamiliar faces of the paramedics leaning over her. The disorientation was palpable. The overwhelming sensory input of the crowded hall, combined with the sudden release of months of built-up political and emotional tension, had exacted a heavy toll. As she was gently assisted into a sitting position, her gaze found William, who stepped through the curtain partition the moment he saw her move. In a low, steady voice, he spoke to her for a brief moment, offering a quiet reassurance that masked the immense pressure bearing down on him from every side of the room. The Prime Minister moved forward half a step from the front line of councillors, his expression a complex mix of deep protocol concern and immediate human anxiety. The Accession Council was legally bound to complete its official business. The proclamation had to be signed, the official declarations logged into the state archives, and the public reading delivered from the Friary Court balcony according to constitutional timeline. Any prolonged delay risked introducing an element of uncertainty into the public sphere during a moment designed specifically to project absolute continuity and strength. William turned away from the medical team, meeting the Prime Minister's eyes with a silent understanding that the machinery of state could not be paused, regardless of the personal circumstances unfolding behind the curtain. With a definitive nod from the new king, the Lord President of the Council cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the thick atmosphere to resume the formal order of business. The remaining documents were presented on the heavy oak desk, their parchment pages rustling softly in the quieted room. William stepped back up to the dais, his movements smooth and deliberate as he took the quill to sign the final constitutional oaths guaranteeing the security of the church and the continuation of the legal realm. Each signature was executed with precision, demonstrating a firm, unwavering hand that sent a clear signal of composure to the 200 state figures watching his every move. The contrast between the fragile human scene behind the screen and the resolute execution of constitutional duty at the table defined the precise nature of the burden he was inheriting. As the medical team discreetly wheeled Camilla out through a private side entrance toward the waiting ambulance in the inner courtyard, a faint murmur passed through the rear ranks of the assembly. The immediate physical crisis had been shifted to the care of specialists, but the psychological impact remained heavily suspended over the chamber. The councillors were acutely aware that they had witnessed an unprecedented breach in the historic choreography of royal transitions. The royal household had spent decades engineering a seamless narrative of authority and duty, yet in less than 10 minutes, the absolute limits of human endurance under the pressure of the crown had been laid bare before the highest officials of the land. William finished the last of the paperwork, handing the quill back to the clerk of the council. He turned to face the room fully, his expression composed, grave, and entirely focused on the immediate task ahead. The ceremonial trumpeters positioned in the gallery above raised their instruments, awaiting the final signal to sound the traditional flourish that would announce the completion of the inner council's work. Outside, the murmurs of the thousands gathered in the streets were beginning to bleed through the heavy timber doors of the palace, unaware of the sudden drama that had just transpired within, yet eagerly awaiting the public appearance that would solidify the new era. The doors to the balcony hallway were pulled open by uniformed attendants, revealing the bright, crisp light of the courtyard beyond. William stood at the threshold for a single beat, taking a deep, measured breath as the burden of office settled fully onto his shoulders. Behind him, the room remained motionless, the Privy Counsellors bowing low in a final, synchronized gesture of deference to the monarch. With steady steps, he walked forward toward the balcony, leaving behind the medical screens and the stunned silence of the council chamber to face the waiting nation, carrying the full, unyielding weight of the crown into the open light. The heavy oak doors leading to the Friary Court balcony swung outward with a low, resonant groan, breaking the vacuum of the internal corridors and unleashing the roaring wall of sound from the crowd gathered in the streets below. Thousands of citizens, packed tightly along Marlborough Road and spilling into the courtyard, erupted into a sea of waving flags, flashing camera phones, and deafening cheers as the heralds in their gold-embroidered tabards stepped into the open air. The autumn wind swept through the courtyard, carrying with it the raw, unscripted energy of a public that believed it was witnessing a flawless, historical tapestry unfolding precisely as planned. But inside the narrow anteroom just behind the threshold, the air remained heavy with the smell of smelling salts, rubbing alcohol, and the lingering, electric tension of the emergency that had just transpired. William stepped out onto the stone balcony, his silhouette framed against the overcast grey sky, instantly absorbing the full force of the public's gaze. Down in the court, the Garter King of Arms unrolled the second proclamation, his voice booming through the high-powered public address system, broadcasting the official words of accession to the nation and the world. Every eye was fixed on the new monarch, searching his face for any sign of the turmoil that had just shaken the foundation of the inner chamber. Yet William stood like an anchor, his posture imposing, his hands resting naturally at his sides, his eyes scanning the crowd with a calm, commanding presence that betrayed nothing of the scene behind him. He understood with absolute clarity that for the next 10 minutes, his visage was the only thing standing between institutional stability and widespread public anxiety. Simultaneously, in the private subterranean corridors beneath the palace, a very different reality was unfolding. The stretcher carrying Camilla was wheeled at a rapid pace down the vaulted brick passageway, surrounded by a tight perimeter of royal protection officers and the king's personal medical team. Her face was ashen, contrasting sharply with the deep navy velvet of her formal gown, and an oxygen line rested lightly over her nose as the paramedics continually checked her pulse and blood pressure. The immediate physical shock of the event had subsided, but the acute strain on her cardiovascular system, compounded by weeks of relentless public scrutiny, physical exhaustion, and the profound emotional weight of the transition, had brought her to an absolute point of collapse. As the medical transport cleared the secure gates and sped silently under police escort toward King Edward VII's hospital, the senior press officers remaining at St. James's Palace found themselves facing a critical juncture. The official live feed of the Accession Council had cut to a static graphic of the royal coat of arms the moment Camilla went down, a move that intended to protect her privacy, but instead triggered a wild, uncontrolled wave of speculation across social media and digital news networks. In the media briefing room, journalists were frantically tapping out breaking news alerts, piecing together the fragmented accounts of Privy Counsellors who had managed to slip out through the side doors. The narrative was rapidly spiraling away from the constitutional handoff and toward the sudden medical emergency, threatening to overshadow the momentous political transition. Inside the palace, the Prime Minister met William at the foot of the grand staircase immediately after the balcony appearance concluded. The brief conversation between the two men was marked by a stark, pragmatic efficiency. The Prime Minister, speaking in hushed tones, emphasized the paramount importance of issuing an immediate, transparent statement to prevent economic markets and international allies from interpreting the event as a wider crisis of state. William, wiping a trace of sweat from his brow, nodded in grim agreement. His authority was absolute, but so too was his understanding that the modern monarchy survived on perception. He authorized a clear, honest medical update regarding Camilla's condition, refusing to allow the palace press office to deploy vague euphemisms that would only feed rumors. Upstairs in the council chamber, the atmosphere had shifted from shocked paralysis to a disciplined, quiet retreat. Attendants worked quickly to fold away the temporary screen that had isolated the collapsed site, restoring the room to its pristine, historical state, though the memory of the event remained deeply etched in the minds of everyone present. Former cabinet ministers and senior clergy lingered in small groups near the doorways, speaking in urgent tones about the sheer velocity of change hitting the institution. The transition was no longer an abstract, theoretical blueprint locked away in Whitehall vaults. It was an aggressive, living process that was testing the physical and emotional limits of the human beings at its center. By the time the convoy carrying the king arrived at the hospital entrance to join his family, the official statement had already been released to the global media, acknowledging the brief collapse due to exhaustion and confirming that the Queen Consort was resting under medical observation. The public, reacting to the news in real time, watched as William walked through the hospital doors with the same unyielding, steady pace he had displayed on the balcony. He was a man caught squarely between two worlds, the ancient, unbending demands of a crown that required complete self-abnegation, and the fragile, unpredictable reality of human life that no decree or council could ever fully control.